You have to think about power as a system. It's a set of relationships and constraints. It's not really an object that can be possessed or lost, but more like a dynamic architecture. And that architecture can be reconfigured. To really understand what's happening now, we have to analyze its structural logic, not just its public narratives.
So, the core idea we're exploring here is this. We are not witnessing a collapse of American power, but its transformation. There's a deep structural shift happening, and it's not being driven by some external military rival. No, it's coming from an internal realignment of capital and interests. The very architecture of power is changing from within.
All right, here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start with the old architecture of military primacy, then look at the rise of what we'll call transnational capital. We'll see how their logics conflict, look at the Gulf stabilization model as a case study, and then wrap up with this idea of a new shareholder imperium.
So let's start with this idea of the diffusion of empire. This is a really key concept. It's a move away from the classic model, a state projecting power over physical territory, and a move towards a much more fluid system where influence is all about global networks of capital and information. This isn't about being defeated. It's about a fundamental rewiring of the system itself.
Okay, so to understand where all this is headed, we really have to look back at how this all started. After World War II, the United States built something pretty unprecedented, a global system. And it wasn't just a military empire, it was a deeply integrated security and financial architecture, all designed to secure its #1 spot on the world stage.
This post-war system was a really comprehensive, layered network. On the one hand, you had the hard power, a global footprint of military bases and formal alliances. But at the same time, you had the soft power, U.S.-led institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, plus all these embedded trade and intelligence networks. It all worked together to weave American interests into the very fabric of the global order.
Now, a whole ecosystem grew up around this system. Defense contractors, think tanks, lobbyists, you name it. For our purposes here, we can define this whole consolidation of interests as neoconservatism. And its core function, its basic operating logic, was to maintain and expand American primacy, very often through a state of perpetual or near-perpetual conflict.
And this gets to the very heart of the system's incentives. The key thing to understand is that conflict wasn't a bug in this system. It was a feature. It generated incredible returns for the private sector, defense-linked capital that was at the center of this ecosystem. The costs, well, those were socialized, paid for by the public, but the profits were privatized. And that created this powerful momentum toward more intervention, more military commitments, all of it wrapped up in highly moralized language.
But then, starting around the 1970s, things like deregulation and globalization gave rise to a totally new force, a new class of actor whose interests would, eventually, break away from that old military first order. Let's call this new force transnational private capital, or TPC for short. We're talking about the huge, multinational financial giants that basically run global finance today. And their defining feature is a structural detachment from any single country. Their allegiance? It's not to a flag. It's to maximizing portfolio returns on a global scale. This is the crucial point, this shift in perspective. These entities operate everywhere. They're post-ideological in their decision-making, and they are purely portfolio-driven. They just don't think in terms of territory or national interest. They think in terms of global capital flows, risk-adjusted returns, and asset allocation.
And what this new class of capital found were profit opportunities that just completely dwarfed the returns from the old defense contracts. I mean, we're talking about massive global infrastructure projects, the energy transition, integrating huge sovereign wealth funds, building new logistics corridors and entire cities. And all of these things require stability, predictability, and long-term planning, the exact opposite of what the old system was built to do.
And this is where we get to the central conflict, the real heart of the issue. A fundamental conflict of logics. The interests of the old military primacy architecture and this new capital optimization network started to move in very different directions. They want different things from the global system.
Let's just put them side by side. It makes the divergence crystal clear. On one side, you've got the military primacy model. It's incredibly expensive, it's ideologically rigid, it creates volatility, and it runs on taxpayer money. On the other side, you have the capital optimization model. This one needs a stable, predictable environment to attract global finance for long-term projects. One thrives on disruption, the other demands stability.
There's a really great metaphor for this whole shift. The neoconservative model is like blockbuster video. It's a rigid, centralized, and ultimately obsolete system that depends on an old business model. The emerging capital-driven model, on the other hand, is like Netflix. It's networked, it's fluid, it's data-driven, and it's globally scalable. And global capital has already decided which model it prefers.
Okay, so let's look at where this new model is actually happening. The clearest real-world example today is emerging from the Gulf states. They are actively designing a regional order where stability itself becomes the main asset, an asset specifically designed to attract and deploy that transnational capital.
I mean, look at the parts of this vision. It's all about creating one seamless, integrated economic zone. We're talking new megacities, linking them up with logistics corridors, pulling in North Africa, and pushing for diplomatic normalization across the board. This is a long-term business plan for an entire region, and it absolutely requires a stable environment to work.
So, if you're looking at this purely through the lens of capital, a perpetual, volatile conflict like the Israeli-Palestinian one isn't an ideological issue, it's a massive liability. It acts as a structural blockage, something getting in the way of this grand economic vision.
And here's exactly why. The conflict physically gets in the way of integrating infrastructure. It creates risk that scares away regional investment. It stops the economic benefits of these huge megaprojects from spilling over into neighboring areas. And it disrupts the very cross-border logistics that the whole model depends on. It's just pure friction against the flow of capital.
So the crucial point here is that the immense pressure we see for de-escalation and ceasefires isn't necessarily coming from some moral or political shift. It is a structural inevitability. It's being driven by the overwhelming interests of transnational capital, which now has the power to discipline state behavior, and that signals the profound weakening of that old military-first logic. So all of this really forces us to rethink the whole American decline narrative. What's happening isn't a simple decline, it's an internal fragmentation and a diffusion of power, and it's being driven by finance.
The key concept to get your head around here is structural fragmentation. This is what happens when a country's most powerful economic actors, its financial elite, stop aligning their interests with the state. They become globally integrated, operating as their own distinct transnational class. And when that happens, the nation's strategic cohesion starts to dissolve from the inside out.
The signs are everywhere. You see this elite investing capital all over the world instead of prioritizing national development. You see them deeply integrating with sovereign wealth in the Gulf and in Asia. They now often oppose costly military adventures that just create volatility. And more they seem to view the American state not as a sovereign authority they need to serve, but as an operational manager for their own global interests.
So let's be really clear. This is not the fall of Rome. The United States is still incredibly powerful, but its power is being reconfigured. This is a financialized diffusion, a process where the concentrated power of the state gets dispersed into a global network of capital. And that network now sets the rules and the incentives for the whole system.
And that brings us to a final, pretty powerful thought that sums this all up. The old empire wasn't conquered by an external rival. It is being reorganized from within, its power dissolving and diffusing into a new, post-national class of global shareholders. And that is the new reality of power we have to understand.